Welcome back to our study in the book of Esther. Esther is all about renewing of faith for a nation. We are in chapter 2 today. Last time we saw about Xerxes and Vashti in chapter 1. Then in chapter 2, today we have Esther and Mordecai. This is the theme verse of the entire book, and who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And we believe, as we see the overall picture of the book of Esther, that Esther was brought to the kingdom at such a time as God's people were going to be exterminated, and Esther was in the right place at the right time with the right person in the right position, walking with the true God. Here is the outline of the entire book. It is loaded with feasts. Every time we turn a page in the chapter of the history, there's a feast going on. So they all have different reasons and different purposes. The feasts were times of honoring victories. They were also times of honoring people, but they were also times of get-togethers where decisions were made. And while Esther is not about the return of any people back to Jerusalem, know that there was freedom for God's people to return during this time. And we can see the route that Ezra and Nehemiah would take. It was usually the red route that they would do that. And then the normal route, which would be longer but safer, is the green one. Susa or Shushan is the main capital of the Persian Empire, and that's where we are. But as we move to another one of the capitals, like a summer capital or the summer castle and palace, we'll make note of that. Here is our chronology and where we are with the three books that fit together: Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And Esther is right between Ezra 6 and 7. And that is where we are time-wise, around 480 before Christ. So the Feast of Ahasuerus is Roman numeral 1, and it's all about Esther's promotion to the queen of being the queen of Persia. And here we have Artaxerxes. It's also called Ahasuerus. And in chapter 1, it was all about the king calling a great feast together, and then he summons his queen to come, and she refuses. And that was not good for Vashti. It was not good for the kingdom. And so Vashti is going to be banished because of the counsel that Ahasuerus sought. His wise men and people around him said, look, this just isn't between you and your wife and the queen. The word gets out on this. It's all about the entire empire and rebellion. Then in chapter 2, this is about Esther and Mordecai, although Xerxes has a portion in here, and you'll see some other players. And so in the first 18 verses found a new queen. After these things, that's as when the king is very angry and banishes Vashti. When the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased or subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. So we left chapter 1 with the king in raging anger. Then said the king's servants that ministered to him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. Young are female servants, and let's find some for the king. And let the king appoint officers in all the province of his kingdom that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, under the custody of Hegai, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things be purification be given them. And so Hegai or Hegai is one of the eunuchs, and he is given the job of being in charge of the king's of chamberlain. He oversees all of the women, and I'll just basically say the harem. He watches them, and he makes sure that the women that serve under him and the ones coming in to the harem are given the right oils and scents and perfumes and whatever is needed to purify them and make them presentable to the king. Here is the Persian Empire, and I put this in just as a frame of reference. It is great. If you'll notice that I read that the king sent word out, was going to send word out to all of the provinces, and here's the empire. So what are the regions or the provinces of the empire? There were 7 of them that made up the government. And I have listed them all here for you to look at, and you can, the good thing is you can stop and backtrack on this video, and you can view where these areas are. And so they were all broken into different areas, and then satraps would be appointed into these areas to watch over them or subdivide them yet up more, and the satraps would overlook them. They would be such as we would call governors. So here's how this worked. Each region or province would have a governor, as I've just mentioned, called a satrap. A royal secretary was also appointed in each province to assist the satrap, but reported to the king directly. All right, so what you had is you had a set of eyes on the satrap, and that he did not have any loyalty, any kind of alliance to him. He owed him nothing. But these two were supposed to work together to keep that province working and functioning and keep peace. There was a garrison commander, and he was in charge of all the military personnel. And he answered back to the king. And so here you had a setup here of 3 separate government officials, and they answered back to the king. But they didn't answer to each other, but they were at the disposal, and they should work together with each other. So royal inspectors called trusted men would roam the provinces and report back to the king. So on top of this, you had another level of what were called royal inspectors, and they would travel between the provinces. And they just dropped in, they would drop in unannounced and spend whatever time they wanted, check that whole province out, go from town to town. And they wouldn't necessarily have to meet with any of these appointed officials. They could bypass them altogether and report directly back to the king that, hey, things are great. And then these would report back and say things are great, and the king would say, okay, that's fine. And let's read on in Scripture. And let the maiden which pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. So bring in these virgins. They go into the actually the area of where the women are, and the purification area are, and they're kept, the court of the women. And let the king meet them, and the one that he sees and thinks would be the best queen, pick him. And the king loved the idea, and he did this. Now in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai. So there's a Jew named Mordecai, and he's working in the palace in Shushan. And he's the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. All right, and so this is the first time that Jew is mentioned in the Bible, and it actually means a Judahite. He's out of the tribe of Judah. And Mordecai means a little man, or in the empire, he's a worshiper of Mars. So what you have, he's the cousin of Esther, and Mordecai was his Hebrew name and meant little man, but Marduk was his Babylonian name that he got when Nebuchadnezzar brought him back and destroyed the city of Jerusalem and took the Jews slave back to the Babylonian Empire. And then Persia beat Babylon, and Marduk was their main god, or worshiper of Mars. So think that through, and that'll make sense, as it was true with Daniel and his 3 friends. They were all given Babylonian names. And so here's the throne room, and we read about Mordecai being in that area. And this is the modern day excavations that are going on. You can see the people walking around. They're very tiny. But in 5 here was where the throne room was, and way back at 1, we'll see some of these different areas. Now, this is a good time to pause, because we're going to talk about something from the past that's going to come up in Esther. And 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles have a verse that fits in here. And so there's a little past history that will bridge to the present. Who had been, so this is the past, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity, which had been carried away with Jeconiah the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father or mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. Hadassah means myrtle, and that's Esther's Jewish name. But we will know her as Esther. So it came to pass, when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together into Shushan the palace, to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought also into the king's house, to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. And the maiden pleased him, made him happy, and she obtained kindness of him. And he speedily, at a very alarmingly rate, gave her things for purification, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meet or were seen or intended to be given her, out of the king's house. They were to take care of her needs. So all of a sudden, she's really no longer a servant. She has servants. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place in the house of the women. And so here's the courtyard and the house of the women over in 2. You remember 5 is where the palace is. And so way over to the far left here, where 2 is where the women are kept. Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, had made known that she was a Hebrew. For Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it, or commanded that she not tell it that she's a Hebrew. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did, and what should become of her. And so every day, I put this big blue arrow here, Mordecai would walk this walk, and maybe out in front and on this close side of the picture, and he could not go in there, but he could walk out in front, and Esther could come out, or Esther could come to a window and or over a wall and speak to him. Now when every maid's turn was come to go into King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, the purification took a year, according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purifications accomplished, to wit, 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women. So this was the process. They really got spoiled in big ways. Then thus came every maiden unto the king. Whatsoever she desired was given her, to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. And the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned unto the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashagaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines, and all of a sudden they become concubines. She came in unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she were called by name. And so they were kept there and could never be called back in, but would be kept. Or she may be called back in at the king's pleasure. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Hegai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the woman, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. The word favor is grace and charm. So she didn't need a lot of trickery. She just brought herself. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast. And he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king, or the power, the strength that he had to show that. Now there becomes a plot, and things get really thick now. And we're going to see one of the reasons that the Lord moved Esther into this position. And there's a very deadly plot coming up, and then we end this chapter. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. And so now he goes out in room 5, down in 5 is where the throne room is, but the king's gate is way over this direction, back over where the palace was. Esther had not yet showed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, 2 of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were filled with anger and sought to lay hands on the king Ahasuerus. Okay, we have a murder attempt coming up, an assassination. I have no idea why they were angry. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified, meaning she said what was in her heart to the king thereof, in Mordecai's name. Mordecai overheard this. He was in the right place at the right time. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. And so we have, once again, the theme of this book is, who knows that you weren't brought to this kingdom for such a time as this? The Lord would raise up Mordecai and Esther and put them in places of leadership and power that they did not abuse, but they realized that their power and their life was in God's hands, while everyone else in the empire thought it was in the king's hands. Then right around here we have the birth of Nehemiah, and we know what's going to come about when he grows up to be a young man. He'll take a group back and they'll rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. So what's our takeaway? Well, with Mordecai, we have a renewing of faith and relationship. And in that, we see how strong Esther's mom and dad die. And her uncle takes her in and raises her as if it was his own daughter. And Mordecai's faith, he made sure that he shared it and he built it into Esther's life. And so it just wasn't establishing a family relationship, it was establishing a godly relationship. Then we also saw in verse 7 the faith in those around us. Not only had he raised Esther and known her for years, but yet he was trusting her that she would not betray him. And so not only is there faith in the Lord, but there has to be faith built in each other and in the family. And we saw that, the solidity and that faithfulness and that upbringing. In Mordecai, we saw renewing of faith and wisdom. And faith renewed in wisdom gives an intuition and a knowledge what Esther would and should do to become queen. Then with Mordecai, we saw renewing of faith in the concern that he had and the love. And faith renews causes and genuine love and concern for those that we genuinely love. He stayed outside in the court to make sure she was fine. He constantly watched over her and kept her and stayed with her and guided. He was always there as her compass to steer her. And lastly, with Mordecai, we see renewing faith in his courage. It took courage for him to step out and say what he had overheard, because if it was found out that he was wrong, he was dead. And Esther would be too, because he told Esther, and Esther went and told the king of the plot against him and saved his life. And so in renewing the faith in this book, already early on in the second chapter, we see it building and growing, not only in Mordecai, but we see it building in Esther, and it's going to start to spill out to the people eventually. But it's also going to spill towards the king. And so we'll leave it off at here today. And there's more incredible things to come in this book. And I invite you to the email that just went by. You can back up to that. This series and this lesson is taught to a live class. And there is a hard copy I'll be glad to send you of the outline and of this lesson or any lesson that you'd request. Just email me. It's free. Thank you, and God bless you.